Welcome to the Education of a Financial Planner, where we look at the major concepts in financial planning through the lens of two quant investors who are learning the ropes of the planning process and how to help clients achieve their long-term goals. Learn along with us as experienced financial planner Matt Ziegler helps us understand the most important financial planning concepts that impact all of us and how we can apply them to achieve the best outcomes in our financial lives. In each episode, we will work through one major financial planning concept from the ground up and learn how we can apply it in the real world. From retirement to college savings to taxes to estate planning, we will cover a wide range of topics that apply to each of our everyday lives. We hope you will join us in our learning journey.
Justin Carbonneau and Jack Forehand are principals at Validea Capital Management. Matt Ziegler is managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Validea Capital or Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Validea Capital or Sunpoint Investments.
In this episode, Jack, Matt, and I talk with Ian Ayres, professor of law and economist at Yale University, and Quinn Curtis, professor of law at the University of Virginia, to discuss some of the concepts in their new book, Retirement Guardrails: How Protected Fiduciaries Can Improve Plan Outcomes. We talk about 401k plan design, the ways retirement plans can improve in an effort to help produce better outcomes for 401k participants, and much more. Anyone with a 401k plan will find parts of this very interesting and possibly very important. Thank you for listening. Ian and Quinn, thank you guys very much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for having us.
I first learned about you through the piece in the Wall Street Journal, how retirement plans should protect employees from themselves. And then in sort of digging into that a little bit, I realized that you have a new book, Retirement Guardrails: How Protected Fiduciaries Can Improve Plan Outcomes, which it seems to me is a culmination of the many years of collaboration and research and data aggregation you guys have been doing on 401k plans. Jack, myself, and Matt, we are all involved with advising investors, whether it's financial planning, which is what Matt does, or Jack and I do more the investment side of things. But obviously 401k plans for all of our clients, most of our clients, play a very important role in their overall retirement savings and just long-term wealth creation. So I think this conversation today is going to be very relevant to like what we do day in and day out, but also the many investors and even professionals that listen to our podcast around 401k plans, some of the shortfalls, some of the pitfalls, maybe some of the ways that they can be improved on, and some of the recent changes. So we're excited to have you. Thank you very much for taking the time this afternoon. We appreciate it. And so, I thought maybe we could just start at a very high level to hear from both of you, whoever wants to take the lead on it, like from a 30,000 perspective, sort of giving us the current landscape of retirement savings and 401k plans in this country, and maybe how they have evolved over time.
Sure, I can start with that. So there's been a lot of progress since Ian and I started looking at these plans. I think when we initially looked at the data, the problem that really jumped off the page was the cost of investing in these plans. A lot of even very large plans had pretty high expenses that made it unlikely that investors were going to do as well as they could. And there's been a general downward fee trend in asset management generally, and 401k plans in particular. And a component of that is this series of lawsuits that have been filed against plans that have really focused fiduciaries' minds on the problem of fees. But if you look at that data, you see that fees at the really big plans have come down a good amount. We'd still say we can do better on that front. But fees at the small plans have lagged behind a little bit in terms of becoming low. And it's always been true that smaller plans have higher costs, just lower economies of scale. But one thing we found in sort of looking at the data is that these lawsuits that have really focused the attention of the industry on fees are targeting the largest plans. And so there's sort of two things and if you're a small plan, even if you're an expensive plan, you're really unlikely to face a lawsuit. So our thinking as we went into this was, well, one, what can you do to think about the whole asset management industry, all the 401k plans, regardless of size, with it, like how could we think about fiduciary duties to improve outcomes for even investors in small plans? And the other is this issue of, as fees on average go down, the relative impact of avoidable mistakes becomes bigger. If I'm in a plan where just I don't have any good options, then my focus needs to be on like, how do we get good options? If I'm in a plan that has some good options, but I'm making mistakes, I'm just allocating assets in a way that makes it unlikely I'm going to get the outcome that I want to have. That's a kind of different problem. So that's really what we're trying to address here. At a top level view, there's been progress made, but that makes it more important to pay attention to menu design and how you can encourage investors, even with a relatively firm nudge, to make sensible choices in their 401k accounts. And that's this idea of guardrails that we wrote up in the Wall Street Journal column and in the book. Should plans should fiduciaries for these plans proactively monitor how their menus are being used and steer investors away from things that presumptively seem to be problematic choices?
Ian, one of the things I know you did years ago was, and I know you didn't handwrite these letters, or if you did, like your hand must have been sore, but you wrote, or you had, you sent like 6,000 letters to 6,000 different plans, basically saying, we've looked at the data and we kind of know what plans are doing things good, but we also know what plans are doing things bad. And, there may have been some pushback, fallout, or whatever from that. So can you just talk about what you guys did there?
Sure. We identified several thousand plans that had indicia of charging super competitive fees. They were paying too much for their investments. And from my Yale Law School letterhead, I wrote to the fiduciaries that on each of these plans, and I told them that you might be paying too much. The fees may be too high, and the letters varied. We had several different treatments that tried to tease out, and we wanted to learn whether we could nudge people toward being better fiduciaries. Some of the letters stressed that they had legal duties. Sometimes we stress maybe it's an informational problem, and we actually told them, here are the funds that you should particularly be worried about. And we tried different types of letters, and the thought was to try to figure out whether we could come back later and see if there had been a chain. And there was a failure of imagination on our part. I know that I sent one letter to each fiduciary, but I just didn't imagine that many of the fiduciaries would turn around that very day and call their advisor and say, hey, this Yale professor says you're overcharging me. What's up? And so there were many advisors that got 30 calls on a single day. And we also had a failure of imagination. We didn't realize how well the advisor industry was organized, and the advisor Associated Press started coming after us, and it did cause quite a controversy for several days.
Yeah, it seemed like reading the Wall Street Journal article, like you got a lot of pushback on this. Like it was probably a pretty stressful time.
It was, but we were confident that we had done everything ethically, and we did it as a public service. This is we wanted to learn if we could make fiduciaries do a better job, and we wanted to see if we could learn something about which kind of nudges worked best.
What did you learn on that front? Were there certain types of letters or certain types of nudges that achieved the best results?
I have to say we didn't really, we weren't able to complete the project, and it's largely because of a regulatory failure. The Form 5500s, the required annual forms that have to be filled out, they're unnecessarily opaque. And indeed, just to be technical for a second, they don't come out on a machine readable standardized form. And so you have to scrape and try to dig out credible information. And frankly, we weren't able to create a substantial enough result data to compare whether particular letters did better. But one thing is clear: we wanted to say, is it possible that some letters to fiduciaries can get them to act? Well, it definitely got them to act, because many of them called their advisors.
Going back to plans overall, Quinn, you referenced before fees coming down is a big improvement we've seen in plans over time. And I'm just wondering, are there others you've seen? Like, one of the things I've heard, at least, and I don't know if this is true, is like that they changed the default recommendation to being invested when someone puts money into a plan. And, that's produced better outcomes over time because people were sitting in cash and not realizing it. Are there any things like that you've seen that have improved over time as well?
Yeah, so the QDIA, the Qualified Default Investment Alternatives, have been, I'd say, transformative, right? In the sense that it used to be you had to actively sign up and enroll in the plan and make your elections, and that was a lot of hurdles for people to clear when they were starting a new job. And so we said, hey, well, let's introduce things like automatic enrollment. Let's automatically invest some of that money in an actual fund instead of dumping it into a money market account. And those are changes that I think make it easier for people to be successful. The
only thing that concerns me about the QDIA revolution, it's 2 cheers for it, not 3 cheers, because many of the QDIAs still charge expense ratios over 50 basis points for a target date fund, and those shouldn't be over 20 basis points.
Yeah, I'd like to see people in a QDIA that's indexed. Like, I think that should be the default for people who are being sort of nudged that firmly into an option. An index target date fund at low cost seems like clearly superior default option for most investors at this point. The other change we've seen recently, and this was relevant at the plan we looked at, is the streamlining trend, right? So the size of menus has come down. And this, again, I think is a recognition within the industry that you're not necessarily doing people a lot of favors by overwhelming them with a really lengthy menu. The plan we looked at, which I'll just say was the University of Virginia plan, and I will also say is a well-run plan. We didn't write about it to bash it. But it, being a university plan, it is under a slightly different legal regime, and so they felt comfortable with literally hundreds of funds. Until 2017, they decided to streamline it down to a couple dozen. And that change takes away a lot of the potential mistakes you could make, the cognitive burden of like opening up a menu. What the heck is this? There are 300 funds. And so that streamlining trend, I think, is a relatively positive trend as well.
Can I take us one level up for a second to people maybe in the advisor role or some of the people who got those phone calls, and maybe just spend a second and explain, because I think a lot of participants would have no clue, and even a lot of industry people don't have a clue about like a 321 fiduciary versus like your 338 investment manager, and kind of like the layers that these fees get tagged on by different, what I'm going to call responsible parties.
Yeah, well, I'd say for investors in these plans, what they should understand is that there are fees that are attached to the operation of the plan itself. And when I say the plan, I mean the plan your employer runs. There are costs associated with that, and those costs are often, but not always, sort of directly charged against the plan assets. There are also costs that are associated with the individual investment options of the plan. So you have a list of mutual funds. Those mutual funds have different costs associated with them. And often the sort of overall cost of running the plan is drawn from those fund costs through revenue sharing. So we don't actually charge anything at the plan level. Everything's just sort of hidden is a strong word, but in fact, part of what is defraying the cost of the plan is the fees you're charging on those mutual funds. Now, the fees are associated with the plan assets, then everyone's paying the same thing. You just pay pro rata. But if the fees are charged at the fund level, then what you pay to be a plan participant is a function of how you want to allocate your assets. And then it might also be helpful to just sort of give an overview of how these are managed. When we talk about the sponsor, we mean the employer, the entity that's creating the plan, that has the ultimate fiduciary responsibility for operating the plans. And then especially as you get down into smaller employers, they don't know a lot about this stuff. So at every level, we have what we term advisors, which can be people in a number of different roles, who provide record-keeping services, who advise you on what type of funds you might offer in the plan. And often those advisors are associated with companies that offer some of these funds. So Fidelity is a large 401k business. They provide advice on managing these plans. They also manage some of the funds that are included in the plans. And so you've got the employer fiduciary creating the plan for the benefit of their employees. And you've got an ecosystem of advisors and other professionals who, for a fee, one way or another, help construct and operate these plans.
I wanted to ask you about the issue of choice. You touched on that before, and choice seems like it would be a double-edged sword to me. You hear people complain a lot with it, and in a lot of plans, that they don't have enough choices. But when you introduce certain types of choices, if those choices are choices that may not be in people's best interests, you end up with significant problems with people over-allocating to things they shouldn't be over-allocating to. So how do you think about that double-edged sword of providing enough choice, but not providing the wrong type of choice?
That's the real trick. My first reaction to that question is I love that behavioral economics has penetrated enough that choice is a double-edged sword is the first place we go, right? Because years ago we might have said choice is an unalloyed good. It gives you more options. Like what could go wrong? And so the idea that when we provide people choices, we're both providing them flexibility, but also the possibility of making a mistake is, I think, the critical observation. And how do you balance that? Well, part of the motivation of this project is I don't think we've really even started down the road of thinking real hard about that. That a lot of plans have historically taken the view that, look, like we put some funds in a basket for you, make the choice you want. And there's very little capacity, if I'm an employer or sponsor, to observe, well, I shouldn't say capacity, the capacity is there, but it's just not a practice to observe what kind of choices people are making. And that's the first step, to understand when I added something to the plan. Yeah.
And just something that where there's just a single edge, not a double edge, is some plans offer funds that no one should invest in, given the other options on the menu. And a simple example of this, if a plan has an S&P index fund with a 20 basis point expense ratio and another S&P index with a 130 basis point expense ratio, no one should invest in the high fee index. And Quinn and I analyzed several years ago a bunch of different plans, and about 10% of them offered dominated funds that shouldn't ever be invested in. And in those plans, about 20% of the assets ended up in these bad high fee options. And so that's a choice that just should be taken off the table.
What's interesting about what you just said is a lot of people believe that 1% S&P 500 index funds don't exist, but they actually still do exist, and some of them still do have assets in them. It's shocking that it does, but it is true that they're out there.
I like the idea of that as a single-edged, just the wrong edge. Yes.
So you used in a paper I was reading that you guys wrote, you used gold as an example of how choice can sometimes lead to overconcentration. So I wanted to just see if you could talk about that example of when funds do offer, or when plans do offer gold, what might happen that's both good and bad associated with that.
This one blew my mind, guys, just so you know. This was one of those things that I read, and I've seen little anecdotal pieces of this as an advisor, but seeing this stat of the breakdown of the 50% did this, the others did this, and then what happened to that 35%.
Yeah, so gold was maybe a little bit the motivating example here, right? That we have a gold fund in this plan. It was taken out when it was streamlined, just a fund that tracks the price of gold. And, we can debate how much one might sensibly put in a gold fund as part of your portfolio. But we also know there are folks out there for whom gold is a very attractive asset class, the gold bugs, right? And so when you offer the choice of the gold fund, are you enabling people to get a modicum of diversification that might be hard some other way, or are you opening the door for gold bugs to make really over-the-top allocations to it? And so we found that about half of the people who invest in the gold fund had 5% or less. So, right, 5% might feel high, it would be to me, but it's maybe not on the face of it crazy. 35% of people who had the gold fund had more than half their money in it. 11% had their entire account balance invested in it. And this was kind of a trend. There were a lot of sector funds and specialized funds. You don't get to 300 funds without offering, some more exotic stuff. And in a lot of cases, the tendency for those who put any of their assets in those funds was to put kind of a lot of their assets in those funds. And so there's that double edge, right? Like, it's not that there's no legitimate use of those funds, but by offering it, you're creating the opportunity for people to do things that, at least on the face of it, look like they might be seriously risking their financial welfare.
Would you describe this as just a choice architecture failure? And Ian, maybe tackle this, because you're outside of Yale. I know if I go near New Haven, I will be approximately 50% made up of Pepe's Pizza by the time I leave. So is this a choice architecture failure of offering something like the gold fund?
And well, to begin with, it's a process failure because the fiduciaries just don't have any idea about that this is happening, that people are putting too large a proportion of their portfolio in narrow sector funds, including a substantial proportion of people invested in gold that have 100% of their planned savings in gold, just massively undiversified. And so there's a process failure, failing to learn what you should learn. And then there's a failure to because you don't know about these, which are the ones where people are particularly making mistakes. There's a failure to streamline, to drop certain funds, and a failure to guardrail, to give warnings, soft guardrails, or to do what's happening all the time with regard to company stock, just put a cap on it. There's Virginia could have safely kept the gold fund, but say you just don't put more than 10% of your assets in it. No, and there's not a single financial economist that would suggest retirement portfolios should have more than 10% gold.
And I might add that, this is a choice architecture problem, but it's one that is kind of endemic to the design of these plans. Like, we just think of a 401k menu as a fund is in it or it's not. And if it's in it, you can pick how much you want to invest in it. And employers are, with the exception of the company stock, which is often guardrailed, and employers are kind of encouraged by the legal framework here to think this way, because the fiduciary duty has historically been characterized as you're supposed to prudently construct a menu, and once you've done that, it's up to your employees to make choices. Some courts have taken that position. And we're asking for us to think a little bit more richly about what it means to prudently construct a menu. To prudently construct a menu means not just to make an in or out decision, but to think a little more deeply about what it means to be a good fiduciary when you're putting something in the menu. And in our view, that includes asking, okay, how is this actually being used? And is this on net leaving the investors in our plan better off? Because I think it's not hard to make the argument that the inclusion of the gold fund is doing more harm than good, right? The people who get a little bit of extra diversification are not going to offset the risk that is being unnecessarily taken by people with half or more of their portfolio.
Do you know, are companies actively educating their participants? Like, my wife's part of she has a few different 401ks, and, I never get forwards from her, like there's a webinar on our fund lineup or anything. But is that something that plans are doing at all?
Not in any effective way. There are actually some legal regulations about disclosures with regard to company stock, but they're delivered in legalese, small font that no one's going to read. There's not going to be the vast majority of plans do not have even robo advising, things that can be brought to scale with. And this is what we call a soft guardrail, that you could have automated analysis and just say, hey, it seems to me that your portfolio is overinvested in X and light in X. You might consider something else to get better diversification. And it's just not happening.
I'll throw this in there too, just as someone who advises on plans and acts in that capacity. It always drives me crazy, the incentives created where you don't have people capable of scaling up the stuff to give that education to the plan participants. And sometimes that money is getting just sucked off into the wrong corners to create the right system to give people like Justin, like your wife, like the education on how to customize this around what her actual needs are.
I mean, that's been a big concern in the industry. When we started writing on this, we got some feedback that, it's like, it's not that there aren't problems in the 401k space, but you should see what happens when assets get rolled out.
Right.
And the idea that, okay, now you get some advice, but it comes at a very dear price. And so, I think, and there's to some degree, right, the sponsors and everyone involved in these plans is operating in the shadow of fiduciary duties that can make them nervous to give the types of advice that would actually be useful. But I think we as law professors, we can sit back and say, okay, well, let's fix that, because that surely is counterproductive. People need more information to make effective choices.
In addition to nervousness about giving advice, I think the advisors often have a conflict of interest about giving better information about the overuse of the gold fund, because or to have advice about this, because in the Virginia plan, this gold option just had a huge expense ratio, and I think often these narrow sector funds that gold bugs and cowboys want to bet the ranch on, they are often not low cost. And so the advisors say, oh, go ahead. Yeah, it's not they don't want or at least they have a financial interest in not correcting some of this non-diversification.
Yeah, I don't think there's much doubt that a lot of the options that are sector funds and the like that attract some degree of overconcentration are higher margin for the asset managers.
And not always, so sometimes for the asset managers, not always for the advisors. I think that's one of those things. It's plan specific, but understanding those layers, both critical and then for I'm going to say the good advisors, like understanding that and helping to guide those decisions to best interest of people. Because if higher margin is driving the investment advice, that's pretty much unilaterally a problem.
I'm just curious, going back to this issue of gold and oversight, if I'm in a plan and I take my entire account and I put it in gold, like what actually happens? Does the plan have any obligations to tell me what's going on? Like, I'm just wondering what actually happens at that point and what maybe should happen to someone who does something like that.
Well, right now, nothing is what, and then what should happen is we think the fiduciaries of the sponsors should, in their quarterly meetings, they should get reports and learn whether people are overinvested in the gold fund. And if they are overinvested, they should start to explore a series of remedies, which could start with soft guardrails. It could migrate to harder guardrails, which by put a 10 or a 10% cap on how much you can invest, or dropping the gold fund and remapping, transferring the money to the default investment or a broad fund unless otherwise instructed.
And when you talk about the idea of guardrails, is that's something the plan would do itself, right? The plan would set the guardrails?
Yeah, and they do it already with regard to company stock. This is not a Star Trek proposal. This over half of the companies with company stock already put caps on, hard caps.
And I assume they would do it on a case-by-case basis with the individual investments. Like, for instance, I might not limit someone in what they can put in the S&P 500, but I would limit what they can put in gold.
And this analysis, one way to think about it for people that are familiar with the term QDIA, a qualified default investment alternative, that definitely doesn't need to have a cap on it because it's, by definition, it's the kind of a fund that you could put all your retirement money in. But any fund that doesn't qualify as a QDIA is one that is a potential problem because you could be unnecessarily undiversified if you put all your money into it.
And another example, right? It's not just over concentrating in like risky stuff either. Like a young employee is just leaving everything in a money market fund is making a mistake too. And a soft guardrail there to say, hey, did you notice that your assets aren't growing because you've allocated them this way is a reasonable nudge. You probably wouldn't want to cap the money market fund because there might be people who need a cash position. But looking asset by asset and saying, why is this in our plan? What is the appropriate use of this kind of asset? And is it reasonable to put a limit on that? I think is a really valid interpretation of what a fiduciary should be doing. And notably, the company stock where they do it is exactly where a plan sponsor is most likely to find themselves holding a liability bag for a choice that an employee made, right? When that stock crashes, there have been a lot of lawsuits around that. And so exactly when the employer starts to internalize some of the costs of those mistakes is when you see the employer step in and say, 10% at most. And so I think a little more hard thinking about the role of these assets in portfolios could lead sponsors to say, you know what, there's lots of scenarios where it makes sense to guardrail investments.
I'm just wondering whether it be hard guardrails or soft guardrails. I mean, they seem to make 100% sense in practice, and yet you don't see them a lot. And I'm wondering why that is. Like, is there some other downside of them I'm missing, or is there just something on the implementation side that's causing it not to happen? Why is this not used like in a more widespread basis?
Well, I think again that the big problem is this process failure to just get informed that since the plan sponsors, those fiduciaries, just never get information in their quarterly meetings. The advisors will give them, this is what the return of each fund is. Here are the returns of comparable funds, but they get virtually no information about how individual portfolios are constructed. So they just don't know how many people are all in a biotech fund. And so it doesn't even get to the second stage of how to correct it, since they don't have a sense of the problem. And in the book, we not only do our own analysis of the Virginia plan, but we discussed several other academic studies, and they all point, if you do an analysis, you'll find at least 10% of the participants are making substantial allocation errors.
I think this is interesting just from a practical standpoint. I used to be a part of a group that helped on the advisory side for a number of these types of plans. And that was one of the things, especially with smaller companies, that this group would do, would be benchmarking sort of the investment returns against what was happening, and then going in and having those conversations. And we talked all the time about how that was such a huge value add to the companies that offered these plans, because we worried about what were the ramifications. Because if nobody said that, I remember we'd go into a company and we would just uncover, to your point earlier, Quinn, about like, here's all the people who are just in the money market because that's the QDIA. And just that simple conversation about, are you sure you want to do this? And 1 out of 10 might be like, oh yeah, here's why. I'm retiring in a year and I need this to be in cash. Or in the good old days, the money market fund's paying 6% risk-free, you know? But for the most part, it would be like, no, I didn't want to do that. I just thought I was putting money in the plan. Or better, the company's putting money in on my behalf, so I'm not even paying attention to it, which is the right choice architecture decision. They're allocating the funds, but then they're being disastrously invested or not in the interest of the participant. So do you think a policy answer at the large scale is the solution, or is it just we need to give the entire industry a kick in the butt?
Well, one thing is just that there are a lot of great fiduciaries out there that want to do the right thing. And so a very concrete thing is ask your advisor to provide some information on whether participants are overweighted in individual funds. That's a pretty simple thing to do. And then from there, you can make decisions about whether that fund is doing what you want for your plan. One thing that we have a chapter on brokerage windows, which is really the Wild West of retirement plans. Virginia does not have a brokerage window, but this is a case where the fiduciaries don't even, they often on the quarterly meetings, they're just told this is the amount of money that's in total in the brokerage. They don't even know what is being invested in. And one of the things that I've been able to analyze the individual investments of a major brokerage window, a major plan with a brokerage window. And one of the big surprises to me is how much money languishes in high fee money market, because you have to fund the brokerage window and then wait for it to clear and then come back and direct it. And like a third of the money never gets redirected. And so month after month, these are, and if you think about a brokerage window investor, these are cowboys that want to do fancy things and they end up in high fee money market. It's just, that's a place where a little bit more information could really help participants out.
I would add that it couldn't hurt for the Department of Labor and the other policy makers to sort of give a thumbs up to this approach. I think there's a lot of risk aversion among the operators who have an incentive to run with the crowd and to not take big risks that aren't going to benefit them, or in a sense the employees might not even appreciate that they benefit from these nudges because they're being steered away from something that they initially wanted to do. And one other potential obstacle here is we've heard from people who operate these plans, whenever you restrict choice, including dropping something from the menu, you get some blowback from the people who liked that. And that's the only thing you hear. And so, at the top making the decisions, there's this some thumb on the scale, like, this is borderline, but if I take it out, I know I'm going to get phone calls. I know someone's going to be like, that was the fund that I really liked. Why did you take it out of the plan? I think Ian might even have some colleagues who think he got some things taken out of the Yale plan. And that's not a huge deal to them, but there's not really a lot of countervailing force except the fiduciary sense that you should be doing a good job. And so one of the things we try to nudge people in the direction of thinking like, it's okay to not listen to the squeaky wheels, because there's a real benefit to a well-architected menu, and you might not get thank yous from everyone who benefits from that well-architected menu, and you might get complaints from the people who don't like the change. But we see that when Virginia streamlined, people started to do better, and we can show that if you guardrail, they might even do better than that. So, that drag that's caused by people complaining is something I think plan sponsors just need to be overcome.
It feels like the libertarian paternalism inside of anything where we're deciding for a group or helping a group to make decisions. Like this is where there's social benefit and there's demonstrable benefit from your work. That's kind of what you're telling us here, right?
That's hope.
Right. And that's right. And we're trying to preserve choice. One of the great things about is that we can impose guardrails and help the 10% that are making some substantial mistakes and leave the 90% completely unaffected. And so try to let people have a little, even invest in some meme stocks and cryptocurrency. Just don't be crazy about it.
This feels a lot like, Quinn and Ian, you're the DJ Jazzy Jeff and Fresh Prince of this. It's plan administrators just don't understand, and it's still okay to go out and party a little, but that's the vibe I'm getting here.
Nice.
That's the first time anybody suggested anything close to that.
I'm going to let you decide who gets to be Will Smith and who gets to be Jazzy Jeff.
And I don't know. Ian's sporting the nice color flowered shirt, so he gets to choose.
And you guys also have to know Matt works a musical reference into every podcast we do. So we're getting to the end here. He had to make sure he got something in.
Couldn't miss.
What would you guys say if you were to look at the participants and how they get the best outcomes from these plans? I mean, if you were to give each of you were to give like one or two pieces of advice, and you've kind of sprinkled it throughout here, some of your responses, but what would you say to these participants that they should be focused on, that they should be looking at when investing in these plans?
Sure. You want to avoid three mistakes. You don't want to pay fees that are too high. So you want low cost investment funds, low expense ratio. You want to be well diversified in broad sectors of the stock market. And by the way, people often make a mistake and don't have a substantial enough portfolio of international stocks. So you want to have at least a third of your portfolio of your stock should be abroad. And the last mistake is exposure mistakes. You want to have the right, not the Goldilocks exposure to stock market risk and return. And to be very clear, no 25-year-old should be all in money markets. You want to, basically reasonable people can differ about the kinds of exposure, but 20-year-olds shouldn't be all in money markets. You should, and generally there is a consensus for a glide path, starting with 90% in stock and ramping down as you get closer to retire.
I think Ian and I are both in indexed target date funds. We discussed this because we actually both have some assets in this plan. And, I think if you talk to a lot of financial economists, you would get a similar answer. I invest my own retirement in low-cost target date funds. And I think there's more to be lost by trying to beat the performance of that kind of portfolio through something like doubling down on gold or crypto, than there is an opportunity cost to just sort of keeping with that state asset class. That's what I do, and that's what I advise my family members to do when they ask.
And, these plans don't always make it easy. Sometimes if you want to find the actual cost of the funds, it's like you have to click in, download this PDF, and then, it's not like you're clicking on the fund. It's a hyperlink that's bringing you to a profile of the fund. It's like a lot of these plan and the platforms are still pretty antiquated in terms of they're just clunky from what at least the ones that I'm a very small sample here because I'm only really referencing the multiple different companies that have handled my wife's 401k plan, which seems to be transferring like once every 5 years. I don't know why, but that's another thing that's kind of going on. And what's interesting with hers is that, and I'm not going to name, it doesn't really matter, but I'm just surprised there's no small cap value index like fund in her plan. There's a couple international, you got large cap represented, value growth, mid cap, there's a value, but there's no small cap value. When I think of like what drives, what could drive the best long-term performance, at least having some small cap value and a broad-based exposure represented, I think would be a nice addition, but it's not an option. So
I was going to say, I would absolutely approve of being the squeaky wheel when it comes to adequate disclosure around the cost of investment options. So we said to plan sponsors, you don't have to respond to the squeaky wheel when it comes to taking something off the menu that doesn't make sense. But investors absolutely need transparency, and employers absolutely have an obligation to provide it when it comes to performance and fees especially. And that's when I think a phone call to your internal operator of the plan to say, look, this information isn't clear enough for me to make the decisions that I need to make is absolutely.
And I think we could do better if regulation could have fewer and more relevant mandatory disclosures. One of the things with computers, it's really not hard to have tailored disclosure. So I bet many people on this call, definitely myself, all receive a mandatory disclosure. Hey, your plan is discontinuing this fund, and it will remap to the QDIA. And this is not a fund that I'm ever been invested in. And so the proportion of disclosures, and I'm a geek that reads these things, but it's like we're trained not to read them because only 5% will have any relevance to us of these important plan disclosures that we receive in the mail.
I think that the federal government for a number of years has been trying to introduce this auto enrollment into 401k plans. I think that's different, right, from the QDIA that we're talking about, which is the default investment option. And and correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe that as part of the Secure 2.0 Act, that now is legislation that's coming down the pipe in terms of 401k plans needing to auto enroll. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I believe it applies to new plans, and which would be a limited impact. But so we have a lot of plans doing auto enrollment. Things kind of become the industry standard, and this seems to be a move to make it a mandatory feature of at least newly created plans. The trick with auto enrollment, because there was a great paper about this, that people tend to treat the auto enrollment contribution rate as sort of a recommendation. And employers tend to be shy about the contribution rate because they're not forcing, but they're automatically foisting this on people. And so I they're initially going to start with a 3% contribution rate, which I think all of you would agree is not where we want people to be. That's going to ramp up over time. But I think automatic enrollment's great, but the thing you need to be careful of then is it going to a good QDIA or one that's excessively expensive? And two, are people going to anchor on the contribution rate at a number that's just clearly inadequate? And I believe the evidence was that the actual average contribution rate for people who participated in the plan was lower after the auto enrollment because you sort of were people, when they thought about it, picked a higher number. So auto enrollment's great, but you got to have the courage of your convictions to pick a number that is somewhere in the ballpark of what people should be saving.
So last, I guess, question for both of you, and this is kind of coming up a level to just overall retirement, I guess, savings here in this country. And, you see these headlines. I don't know if this is the exact figure, but, the average American has like $400 saved for retirement or something like that, So, clearly many people, for a lot of different reasons, haven't been able to save or don't necessarily know the power of investing in savings. And there's an educational piece to that. There's obviously an opportunity piece to that. There's a lot of different factors that play into that for all different types of people. But, if you both could kind of try to have ideas around how to help more people effectively save long-term for retirement, do you have any thoughts or ideas? Like, I know one of the things that you mentioned, I believe, was this supplemental Social Security option. Maybe shake that out a little bit, and then any other ideas that can help, those that haven't saved for retirement, hopefully try to get on track.
Sure. So with supplemental Social Security, if this is a more far-reaching regulatory innovation, and it would be to give people the option of doubling their Social Security benefits. And but the doubling would only be by default, and that you could, if you don't want to do it, you could opt out. But we could start having actuarially fair purchase of additional Social Security benefits that could happen. And one way to implement this is we could even have a requirement that every retirement plan has as one of its investment options supplemental Social Security, where each instead of directing it to a target date fund, you are directing it to Social Security, which has a lot of advantages. It is inflation indexed. It's a very low cost system. The Social Security Administration, it's just amazing how little they charge in administrative fees, or how little their administrative fees are. It's a very efficient transfer system. And so you could imagine a world where we, and by doing this, you could even create this for employers that don't have 401k plans. All employers are already sending checks to the Social Security Administration. This would just mean that for some employees, they sent larger checks to help fund extra Social Security. And the final thing I'll just mention is leakage from retirement plans. When people take out money early, paying the 10% penalty is a substantial problem. That estimates that about 1% of retirement portfolios leak out every year, and there are some practical things we could do to try to put some sandpaper or I don't know the right image to stop the leak. I'd also suggest a final thing that to keep on our policy thing is that there used to be that the equity in the home was a third of retirement savings, and cash out refi has really decimated that as a source. And I think there's an argument to have policymakers think about trying to tax or nudge people away from cash out refis, because it really is having long-term impacts on retirement saving.
So for me, I think Ian presented this paper to a crowd and sent me some notes from it. And one of the notes was just rearranging deck chairs on Titanic. That these ideas at the edges of how to make these plans work a little bit better is in the face of an under savings problem that's really substantial and worrisome. So Ian's probably better at the big picture policy solutions here. But I will say, I hope that, since we've spent years kind of critiquing these plans, that it doesn't become a deterrence to anyone saving in them. Like, we should improve these things, but these are still important vehicles. And the other is, to the extent that an obstacle to savings is not, I just don't have money to put away, but I am intimidated by the choices I need to make, the potential to make mistakes. I feel completely unsecure operating in the space. It's not just I forget to reallocate from the money market fund after I deposit. I'm terrified to touch it because I have no idea what I'm doing. These interventions, the guardrails, I hope that they could provide some comfort to people, even the soft ones, that it's harder to make a mistake than you've been led to believe, that at least to some degree, the system has your back against doing things that seem truly outrageous. And if that makes people a little more willing to participate in this system, which is the system we have for better or worse, I think that could hopefully encourage a little bit more savings.
Great. Thank you, guys. The book is called Retirement Guardrails, How Proactive Fiduciaries Can Improve Plan Outcomes. You can Google both Ian and Quinn to go to their respective school pages where you can find all of their research and work that they're working on. We very much appreciate you joining us, guys, and this has been valuable and insightful, and I think anyone listening to it will learn from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, guys. This is Justin again. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant. You can follow me on Twitter at JJCarbonneau, and follow Matt on Twitter at CultishCreative. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment. Also, if you have any ideas for topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please email us at excessreturnspod@gmail.com. We would like this to be a listener-driven podcast and would appreciate any suggestions. Thank you.